All right, so in the first video, we looked at the T and P for TP Fast. We looked at the title, and we paraphrase. And that's probably the most time-consuming part, is that paraphrasing. Because in a poem, that really does mean that you go chunk by chunk. You go sentence or part of the sentence by sentence. So our next thing that we're going to do is figurative language. So looking for the figurative language in this. And I'm going to switch to a different color so that it is easier to see. And using different colors as you annotate is one way to really look at each of the pieces separately as we're analyzing a piece of literature. So, figurative language. Wanting to say things, I miss my father tonight. His voice, the slight catch, the depth from his thin chest, the tremble of emotion. And in something he has just said to his son, his song. Okay, so we said that the colon was important. We planted corn one spring. We planted several times. Okay, so there's definitely repetition. We planted. But this one particular time, I remember the soft, damp sand in my hand. Okay, so we're getting a lot of, we're getting that this is past tense and that we're memory. I'm also kind of paying attention to the fact that this is a really short line. Okay. My father had stopped at one point to show me an overturned furrow. The plowshare had unearthed the burrow nest of a mouse in the soft sand. Very gently, he scooped tiny pink animals into the palm of his hand and told me to touch them. We took them to the edge of the field and put them in the shade of a sand-moist clod. I think this is kind of an interesting, sand-moist clod, an interesting phrase. I remember the very softness of cool and warm sand and tiny alive mice. So tiny is repeated, and my father saying things. Okay, so not a ton of figurative language, but there's definitely repetition. There's some, maybe alliteration, something he has said. There's a lot of S's. Times. Okay, so I see a lot of repetition. I don't really see a lot of like similes, metaphors, things like that popping out at me. I may see some later. I do think tiny pink animals, tiny alive mice. I think that repetition is tiny, is important. So maybe the narrator or the speaker kind of relates to being small. Maybe with his interactions with his father. Okay, so that's kind of a guess that I'm making at this point. All right, so attitude. And the way I like to look at attitude is I just really try to, if I can't get the attitude just from the feeling, I like to look at what's positive in it, what's negative, looking at words. What type of words is the author using? Okay, so I get a slight catch, I get a tremble, I'm using another color, emotion, and something he said to his son, so there's that family. Okay, the father showing him something, and it's unearthed. And he gently scooped out the animals, told me to touch them, took them to the edge of the field and put them in the shade of a sand. So as I'm looking through, I remember the very softness, cool and warm sand, and tiny alive mice, and my father saying things. So there's definitely, I think, a nostalgia. There's, I think the speaker, attitude, is that he is nostalgic. Okay. He is looking back fondly. All right, and so the next thing we're looking for is shift. Is there a shift in tone, or do things stay the same? So what that means that we're looking for is that sometimes when we look at a poem or any kind of work, a lot of times at the very end, they'll switch. They'll be talking about one thing and then they talk about another thing. So they'll talk about how bad something is, then maybe talk about how good it is. I don't think in this one we really have a shift. So I'm going to write no shift. There's not a change from the beginning to the end. He's got this sweet memory with his father, and it's very nostalgic. Okay, so next is symbol. Identify a symbol and interpret the meaning. Well, I definitely want to identify the mice as a symbol. Okay, so they're plowing a field, they're in a hurry, but these mice that are tiny and pink, and they're tiny and alive, and the dad takes care of them. So, symbol of the father's love. Maybe a symbol of the father's gentleness. And I think that this up here too, from the depth from his thin chest, the tremble of emotion. This isn't like some hard farmer who is, you know, blaring country music and stuff. He's a gentle guy. And I think that the mice are the symbol of that. Okay, so syntax. It says isolate a unique sentence structure in the selection, determine the author's purpose. So again, I think we have some shorter lines at the end of the lines. I think we've mostly looked at the words. Syntax is that, you know, what are the words and what's the sentence structure? And we've already talked about most of it, but just to kind of highlight it, we had the semicolons, okay, and we've got a colon. We've got one stanza that has no punctuation. We've got one stanza that is shorter, that's only 3 lines. So we've got a lot going on there.